Okay, okay. Now, one of the ways I thought of Muhammad and the Empires of Faith is as a response to, as a serious response to the claim, which maybe I've made in certain ways, that the Islamic sources are difficult, if not impossible, to use to get at what really happened. I mean, your sort of conversation partner there is Patricia Crone, who said you can accept them, something like you can accept them or reject them, but you can't work with them. Is that right?
Like
There's a quotation, something like that.
That's pretty close. That's close enough, if that's
okay.
right.
All right, something like that. Yeah. So, I mean, is that a good way of conceptualizing this project? Is that what you're up to here, to show that yes, you can work with them?
Yeah. I mean, part of it is, I think that the sources that are available to us have changed significantly. And I think there's a lot of shorthand that folks have been lazily relying upon, and maybe it's just a byproduct of some of the outdated materials that we teach with and stuff like that, which you always learn when you're going from, like, when you're kind of going to the newer scholarship to kind of the older ways of just conceptualizing and building a course or building a system and things like that. So I want to intervene on a number of levels. So I'll just might as well just tell you one of my the things that annoy the crap out of me the most. So when people say something like, our earliest biography of the Prophet Muhammad is by Ibn Hisham, is written by Ibn Ishaq, but we only know Ibn Ishaq through Ibn Hisham, and who knows all the things that he changed or left out. And it's so totally wrong. I think that's, like, to me, like, the number of sources that we have that are that represent the early Arabic tradition, the early Arabic historiographical tradition that emerged in the 2nd century, which is shared by the Umayyads and the Abbasids equally, is very large and very robust. And I think it's totally underappreciated. And so part of me, I wanted to push back and say, we have some, a impressive number of sources. I mean, you can just like name them. It's not just like Ibn Ishaq, but like my other guy, Muhammad ibn Rashid. We're going to soon have Musa ibn Uqba, whose manuscript was just discovered and is going to be published. We have people like Ibn Jurayj in his tafsir. We have Muqatil ibn Sulaiman. We have Abdullah ibn Mubarak. We have Malik ibn Anas. And like, that's just some of them. We can kind of expand upon the stuff with even non-Sunni material. Like one of the materials that Patricia herself worked on that I think is still overly neglected is the Risala of Salab ibn Dhakwan, which is an Ibadi text, so it's a non-Sunni text, and it contains a lot of very interesting historical narrative in it. And this, to her, is more or less written sometime around the turn of the 7th and 8th century, so around 700 or so. And there we already have the general outline of early Islamic history. We have the idea of Uthman codifying the Quran to give a more Quranic example. Quotations directly from the Quran throughout the entirety of the text is more or less the same thing. I mean, these sources, I think, need to be given their day. But at the same time, I don't want to say that there's so much that we know 100% for certain. Kind of the main metaphor that I like to use is the idea of of high resolution versus low resolution. I think that we have a pretty robust low resolution image of what the Prophet Muhammad's life was in its basic outline. I think we have a really great idea of what his preaching was about. I think that's recorded in the Quran. I think that's our saying source. That's our cue. And I think that the general outline of his life goes around this hinge of the Hijrah. I think you can deduce that from the Quran. I think you also have robust reason to believe that the general outline in the Sirah literature is correct as well. And I think we can do stuff like that. Now, if you go down to a more higher resolution question, things get really interesting and things get very difficult to affirm the historicity. So I would never in a million years myself say that the story in Ibn Ishaq about the year of the elephant, for example, Abraha marching the elephant up to siege Mecca, and then Muhammad's born that year, and blah, blah, blah. I think that's totally a historical.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
With some hesitation, because this is really, really interesting. But
Yeah.
let me give you another example. So that's from the year of Muhammad's birth, the tradition of the
Yeah.
elephant. So
Yeah.
dated through a complicated way through
Yeah.
570. But what about just something from his life, in his career particularly, and something you deal with towards the end of the book, which is the call narrative. So
Yeah.
what would you say about that? I mean, you have an interesting sort of thought experiment by comparing it to, I think, some English monk guy who had a similar sort of experience. But like, could we ever know something that Muhammad was really on Mount Hira, and whether or not you believe in the angelic visitation, but had some experience there of feeling that he had a revelation?
Yeah. So my version of that is basically no. I don't think that that's a historical story, even though I think it might have historical elements in it. So what in my last one, what I try to show is that a lot of the Sira literature was written to compete with, and in the process of competing, drew from hagiographic models. And we can see these hagiographical models by comparing the stories. Like, so the story that you mentioned is Kedmon. So his story appears in the Ecclesiastical History of the Venerable Bede, and his story matches the Prophet Muhammad's Iqra story beat for beat, and it's extraordinary how close they are. And considering that they were, separated by thousands of kilometers, which, 1,000 kilometers back then was many, many more kilometers than they are now. So someone writing in the marshes of Northumbria versus someone like writing maybe in the Hejaz or in Syria or in Baghdad or whatever, these are very different localities. How can we explain their similarities, right? And so I'd argue that they're both drawing from a common kind of hagiographical store of material. And that's why they look similar. And I try to keep open the possibility that perhaps the Arabic story could have influenced the Latin story or whatever. I've become less influenced of that, less convinced of that option, I think, since I wrote the book. And maybe if I rewrote it, I would be a bit more strong on like the common hagiographical source for a number of reasons. But I don't think that is necessarily historical story. But also I do think it does have historical elements in it. And so what do I mean by that? So when, like in a lot of my grad classes, when we deal with these stories, we talk about the differences between semantic memory and episodic memory. Okay, so memory is a funny thing, right? I don't know if you ever had this experience where you had this memory of an event or whatever, you were sure that you were there, or you knew someone that was sure they were there and experienced it, but then you later have a record of it, you weren't really there or something like that. I'll give you like one of my examples from my life. When I've always had kind of long hair, at least most of my life. And when I was in college, I used to do this silly thing where I would act like I hit my head on something and make my hair go back. It was dumb. Right? It's this juvenile joke that I'd like, oops, and then act silly in public. And I had this one time that it backfired on me because I act like I hit something and I turned around and I didn't see someone was sitting next to me, and I fell over them and I was like spread eagle over the guy's lap, and I'm absolutely humiliated. And so I used to tell that story to one of my friends and we'd laugh about it. And somehow one of my friends from college, even though he wasn't there, he got to this thing where he liked to tell the story, and he would always tell the story as if he was there. I didn't even know him at the time the event happened, but he told that story again and again, and we would laugh whenever he told the story. What he didn't know is we were laughing because we're laughing at him because he was like, and then I saw him with my own eyes. Like he had a false memory that he kept on retelling, right? And so that being said, memory can fool you in terms of episodes that you remember from your life. You can create fake episodes, you can have fake memories and not even realize it and things like that. However, there's a semantic aspect of memory that seems to be pretty reliable. So these are things like, well, he doesn't have a memory of me being on Mars and this happening, or even in London or whatever. His memory of me of this stuff happening all took place in the location where I was from. right? And so the semantic aspects, like there was a place called Mount Hira, there was a place called Mecca, and things like I think those things are broadly accurate. I think
Got it.
just like
Okay, that's clear.
yeah,
Yeah.
like those things to me are a lot harder to kind of make up out of nowhere.
So, and we're getting over time here, so I haven't held good to the 10 minutes that I promised. But yeah, I mean, what do you think about something that I don't know appears here and there in mostly Western scholarship, which is the how do you put it, like the productive nature of storytelling for history.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about another anecdote that you analyze in this book, which is the story of an emissary delivering the prophet's letter to Heraclius, the Byzantine emperor, I think in Damascus. I think it's not in Constantinople, but in Damascus.
In Busra. It's in Busra.
It's in Busra. Okay, so in Syria, but not in. Okay, so in Busra.
I think maybe it depends on the version too. So
okay. In any case, it's definitely Syria because Abu Sufyan, the prophet's nemesis, but later Muslim, shows up. I mean, so storytelling. I'll just give you my 2 cents on this really quickly, and you can, push back or whatever. But I mean, we know that storytelling produces narratives in part because. Not only with early Islam, but also with Christianity and Judaism and everything else. American history, we have all these stories which sometimes are just outlandish, so a sort of a good rational critique would probably undermine them, or which contradict each other, or which are so obviously playing a certain function, like they just fit so neatly into that function that, I don't know. Like an anecdote which explains an ambiguity in a text. So, like for example, one that I like to raise with my students is twice the Quran says that the Israelites in Medina, or the Jews, they would say to the Prophet, "Our hearts are covered." Well, it's a little more confusing than that, but and so then we get stories which say, oh, Muhammad was walking in Medina, he was preaching Islam to them, and they said, we won't listen to you because our hearts are covered. So that kind of story, like, did it really take place? Well, it fits so well the function of giving a story to explain the text that it makes me skeptical. So in this, all the way back to Heraclius, Abu Sufyan, and the emissary and the prophet's letter, all of that, I mean, isn't that like that kind of story just storytelling? Does it have to have any connection to history at all?
That's a story that I think is totally like ahistorical, even though it's really, really early. It doesn't have to have any kind of connection to history. I think a lot of times what we get with these stories is, what we get with these stories when we do kind of our source critical analysis of them, we try to find all the different versions and things like that. We definitely get a sense of how the sausage is made, right? So we have a sense of like, well, how is the story that we know of made? Why does it exist? For what purpose?
Just
what
to say,
original context? What's it draw from? So is the original context? This is one thing I sometimes get. Is the original context al-Bukhari compiling his Sahih, because this story appears in the Sahih al-Bukhari, right? Does it reflect an ideology of Bukhari, or is he drawing upon an earlier source? And what is that earlier source? And what about, and so if you trace kind of the history of these stories, we sort of learn about the ideologies that are behind them, right? And so for me, what you learn from tracing the origins of that story in particular is the way that early Muslims saw themselves as party to sort of a contest of empires, or really, to use their words, a contest of dominions, right? Who has God given dominion, right? And who is God kind of favored?
Is the Arabic word mulk behind that?
Yeah, mulk. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, like, really what this is a story about this kind of ideology of why has God favored us and disfavored them, right? And it is interesting in all sorts of other aspects too, insofar as it has a portrayal of Heraclius, right? And so how is he portrayed, and what's his literary function of his depiction is this and that and the other, and things like that, and how do those depictions draw from what they the historical realities of the person who's telling the story. I mean, so there's a lot of parallel stories about these rulers. Like one of the other examples, I think the Heraclius stories is a model for the other stories, but the other story about a prominent ruler is the Shah, the ruler of Persia, how he receives his letter and from the prophet, and he rips it to shreds, right? And of course, the response to that is that your kingdom will be ripped to shreds, right? But Heraclius and his kingdom kind of survives, and why is that? You know, and for that first story, you have this kind of appeal, I think, this parable of Jesus, right, where God kind of gives the land to kind of new tenants, right, because of the sins of the previous tenants. And you have this interesting theology of supersession that comes into play.